So we're going to be looking at neurophysiology. So we should already know what this word means. Neuro refers to the nervous system, and remember, physiology is all about function. And so what we're talking about is how does the nervous system do the things it does. So before we actually get into neurophys, though, I want to do a little bit of an overview of the nervous system so that we have some idea of what it is that we're talking about. Now, we're going to come back later on and talk a whole lot more about the anatomy of the nervous system. But here's just a brief introduction. So if you look at the nervous system, it really has only three functions. So one of those functions is that it gathers information. It's constantly gathering information. And that information can come from all over the place. It could be internal information. It could also be external. So it could be things like light, and it could be things like sound, and it could be things like that. But it could also be touch and all those things that we think of that we get from our external environment. But it can be other things too from the internal environment. It could be information about what our blood pressure is, or what our heart rate is, or things like that. And so all that information is called sensory information. And so the job of this nervous system, one of its jobs, is to pick up all of that sensory information. But we can't just have the information and do nothing with it. We have to send it somewhere so it can be analyzed. And so that's integration. And so integration happens in the brain, and it happens in the spinal cord. It's a place where all this sensory input is put together. We analyze it, we figure out how important it is, and then we make decisions of it. And then finally, if the decision is something that needs to change, we're going to have some other tissue, some other organ to do that. And so we're going to have to send information to that other organ. And sending that information is what's called motor function. So motor function, or motor output. And what it does is it sends information to the effector organ. And the effector organ would be all kinds of things. It could be the heart, it could be glands, it could be skeletal muscles, it could be lots of things. And we're going to get some sort of response. And so if you look at this, it should remind you of what we talked about when we talked about negative and positive feedback systems. Remember when we talked about negative feedback? And we said that negative feedback, remember, brings the situation back to normal. But there were three things that had to happen. We had to have a sensor, we had to have an integrator, and then we had to have an effector. Well, this is very similar to that, except the nervous system is not an effector. It's not an effector. What it does is it activates effectors. So the nervous system is going to pick up the information, it's going to integrate it, it's going to make decisions, and then it's going to tell something else what to do. And all of this is done electrically and chemically. Another thing about the nervous system is it has an organization to it. And we can look at this organization and we can divide it up. And if you look at this picture here, you can see the two big parts of the nervous system. First, there's the central nervous system. And the central nervous system is the pink part here on this slide. And it's got two major components. It has the brain and it has the spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. Nothing else, just the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain and the spinal cord is where integration happens. It's where decisions are made. It's sort of like a command center. It also includes things like memories and things like that, so that we can make better decisions. And then finally, it's going to control these other organs. So the central nervous system is a big processing center. It's where everything sort of happens. It's a processing center. But we also have information coming to the processing center and information going out of the processing center. And so when we look at it, it's the yellow part here. And the yellow part is what's called the peripheral nervous system. And so the peripheral nervous system is a bunch of nerves. And we'll talk about specifically what a nerve is later on, but you can think of it almost like a wire. It's a wire that connects. And so like you have a wire on a phone or a wire on a pair of headphones or a wire. That's kind of what it is. In other words, all it is a pathway for information to flow. So information flows to the brain and the spinal cord, and information flows from the brain and the spinal cord. And so we have nerves. Well, some of these nerves attach to the brain. So there's the brain, and look, there's a bunch of little nerves right there. These nerves are called cranial nerves. And then here's the spinal cord right here, and there's a bunch of nerves that attach to the spinal cord also. And these are called spinal nerves. And together they make up this peripheral nervous system. So again, peripheral nervous system is these spinal and cranial nerves. They're in pairs, and remember they're going to carry information to the central nervous system, and they're going to carry information from the central nervous system. And so another way to divide it up is by the direction that the information is going. Is it going toward the central nervous system? Or is it going away from the central nervous system? And so another way to talk about these nerves is which direction is the information going. So look, here's our nerves, there's our cranial nerves, here's our spinal nerves, all of these. But some information goes this way, toward the central nervous system. Some information goes this way, away from the central nervous system. And so when we look at this, we're going to see two words. There's one word, which means toward. So this information is going toward the brain or the spinal cord. And then there's another one, this one, which means away. Well, if you look at these two words, look, they're spelled exactly the same except for the very first letter. Exactly the same except for the very first letter. So you need to make sure that you understand that they're different. So the words are afferent and efferent, but they sound so much alike that when I say it for students, I'm going to say afferent. And when I say the other one, I'm going to say efferent. Now, technically, that's not the way they're pronounced, but it makes it easier for people to hear. Does that make sense to everyone? So look at this. We divided this up into the central and peripheral nervous system. We already know that. But then we had those nerves. And so if you look at the nerves, they're going different places. So look, this is going to a muscle out here in the arm or something like that, or in the leg. But there's also nerves that are going to the lungs, and there are nerves that are going to the heart. So it depends on if it's going out to muscles or into the heart. We can categorize them differently. If it's going to muscles or skin, we call that somatic. So somatic, the word soma means body. This is body walls. So the walls of the body. And so it includes everything out here, all of this, everything out here, all of this, anything to do with muscles, anything to do with skin. But if it's internal organs like this, like the heart and the lungs and the intestines, the stomach, all of those things, those are called viscera. And so this is called visceral nervous system. Another name for it is autonomic. So look, when we go through here, we can divide that up. So here is our somatic. Do you remember what that means? What does somatic mean? Which part does it go to? Anybody remember? This is all about muscles and skin. And then visceral or autonomic. What part does that refer to? What does that go to? Internal organs, exactly. And then we already know what these other words mean. Remember, afferent means toward. So look what it's going toward. It's going toward the central nervous system. It's going this way. And then efferent, remember, means away. And it's going away from the central nervous system. It's going this way. Same thing over here. So if we look at this and think about it, here's a nerve, and it goes from the brain or the spinal cord, and it goes to a skeletal muscle. So it's going from the brain to the skeletal muscle. So is that toward the central nervous system or away? And is it afferent or efferent? Zoe says efferent. That's exactly right. And then we just going to the muscle. So what is it? Somatic or visceral? So what this nerve is a somatic efferent nerve. But if we look at a completely different one, look, here's the heart. And this nerve is going to start here in the heart, and it's going to go to the spinal cord, to the central nervous system. So it's going toward the central nervous system. What's the word for toward? Afferent, exactly. And then look where it's coming from. It's coming from the heart. So is that somatic or visceral? Is it somatic or autonomic? It's visceral autonomic, or sorry, visceral afferent or autonomic afferent. Does that make sense to everyone? We can do that with all of these things. So when we look at this and we see somatic afferent, we automatically know it's coming from the skin or the muscles, and it's going to or toward the central nervous system. That's just how this one works. If we pick a different one and look at it, somatic efferent, we know it's going from the brain because it's away, so from the brain to the muscles. So it goes from brain to muscles or to the skin. And then the same thing over here. So if I were to say to you these words, I don't have that slide. If I were to say to you these words, somatic afferent, or visceral afferent, or somatic efferent, or visceral afferent, you should be able to tell me where it starts and where it goes. Sorry, that should be efferent. Does it make sense? So somatic afferent, from skin and muscle to the brain. Visceral afferent, from internal organs to the brain. Somatic efferent, from the brain to the skin and skeletal muscles. Visceral efferent, from the brain to the internal organs. Everybody see how that works? And then finally, all of these others, that's where they stop. But this last one over here, visceral or autonomic efferent, also has two branches, two separate branches. They're both efferent, so they both start in the brain and go to internal organs, but they do different things, and so we have different names, and they're called sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if we look at this picture right here, we should be able to figure out what these are. And so if I were to blank out these letters here, these words, and that's easy to do, so I could do that, and this would make a great quiz question if I blanked them out. Just by looking at them, you should be able to tell what they are. So let's look at this one right here. Look at the arrow. So it's going from the spinal cord to skeletal muscle. So what is it? Is it visceral or somatic? Is it afferent or efferent? It's somatic efferent, exactly. And then look at this one. It's coming from the heart. Look at the arrow going from the heart to the central nervous system. So it's heart. So what is this one going to be? And it's going toward visceral afferent. Remember, visceral also is called autonomic. That's exactly right. Remember, this looks like that. Here's skin going toward. What would that one be? Somatic afferent. And then finally, let me erase this stuff. Finally, remember there's two different parts of the visceral efferent. Now you can't tell which one's which by looking at them, but together these are both visceral efferent. And remember, visceral efferent, the names of the two different ones are sympathetic and parasympathetic. Does this make sense to everyone? Any questions about it? So if we go back to this flow chart, hopefully now when you look at it, it should make a lot of sense. So the whole thing is the nervous system, divided up into the central and peripheral. Central is nothing but the brain and the spinal cord. Peripherals are all these nerves. And all these nerves, some of them are going to skin and skeletal muscle, some of them are going to internal organs, so that's somatic versus visceral. Some of them are going toward the brain and spinal cord, some of them are going away, so that's afferent and efferent. And then finally, this one, remember, has two branches. They're both efferent, but that's sympathetic and parasympathetic. So Zoe asks, how do we differentiate between sympathetic and parasympathetic? And Kaylee says, what's the difference? Okay, so that's a whole extra chapter, but we can do a real quick thing here. So look at the heart. So we want to control the heart. So think about what we want to do with the heart. What if you exercise? What do you think you want to do with your heart? Would you want to make it go faster, or you would beat harder, or would you make it want to go slower and softer? Yeah, so we need something to tell it to go faster and stronger. That's this one. But what about when you stop exercising? Do you want it to keep going faster for the rest of your life? No, and so we need a different one to tell it to go slow. And so this particular system has dual controls. Dual control. So we can make things go bigger, and we can make things go smaller, we can make things go faster, we can make things go slower. Now, like I said, when you look at this picture, you can't tell which is which. You'd have to have some other indication. So he says, I heard parasympathetic and sympathetic. Well, one of those is like fight or flight. This one is fight or flight. So fight, you're going to try to protect yourself and fight off something that's going to hurt you, or flight, you're going to run away from it. But this one is called rest and digest. So think about this. You've been exercising, now you're going to rest and you're going to have a snack. You don't want this heart to keep pumping hard. You want it to slow down so you can go bring things back to normal. But there's a whole chapter associated with this. We'll get to it. Okay, So that's just a very short introduction to how the nervous system is organized. And so we're going to start talking about how it works. Well, it works on a cellular and subcellular level. So we have to talk about the cells first. And we've already mentioned them. We've already looked at them. When we looked at the nervous system, remember we saw that there were two different types of cells. We had these big cells. Remember, those are called neurons. And then we had all these little bitty cells, and those are called neuroglia. So when we look at that, we have these two types of cells. Well, neurons are the ones that do those functions. So remember, there were only three functions. We had this sensory function that was picking up sensory information. We had this integrative function where decisions were made. And then we had this motor function where we're going to tell every other cell what to do. Well, the cells that do these three functions are the neurons. And the way they do it is with electrical signals. So neurons actually can produce electricity and then send that electricity down all the way from one place to another, from the brain to like the heart. And so we can talk to the heart. And we're going to do it electrically. We're going to send little tiny electrical signals down the surface of this cell. And what's going to happen when we get all the way to the end is we're going to release chemicals, and those chemicals are going to talk to the heart. So these are the cells that do that. So in other words, neurons are very, very, very specialized. They're so specialized they really cannot do anything else except this. That's it. That's all they can do. In other words, they can't feed themselves, they can't take care of themselves, they can't get rid of their waste products. They're very, very delicate, they need protection, and that's the job of all these other cells. These are called neuroglia. So neuroglia, glia means glue. It's sort of the glue that holds the nervous system together. They're support cells. So look at all the things they do. They nourish, they protect, they guide, they do all kinds of things. And so when you look in here, there are going to be more neuroglia than there are neurons. But the neurons get all the glory, if you want to think of it that way. So we're going to look at each of these different types of cells. And we're going to look at neuroglia first. So when you look at neuroglia, they have all different functions. Remember, support, nourish, protect, guide. They also wrap themselves around those other cells and insulate them. And so there's all these different functions. Well, when you have a bunch of different functions, you have to have different types of cells. And so there are 6 types of neuroglia. And so when you look at them, here are the 6 types. In the central nervous system, there are 4 different types. And in the peripheral nervous system, there are 2 different types. And look how different they look from each other. And that's because they do very different things. And so let's look at them and talk about what they do. We're going to look at the ones in the central nervous system first. Remember, there are 4. The 4 are astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. So if we look at them, here are those 4. So astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. Let's look at astrocytes first. Astro means star, like astronomy. And so these are sort of star-shaped cells. They're the most common. They're very versatile. And when you look at them, they look like this. They have arms. They're highly branched, and they have these little arms. And what they do with these arms is they connect a blood vessel. This is a blood vessel, a capillary, a little tiny blood vessel. They connect it to the neuron. Look, they connect it to this one here, the neuron. And so what they do is they take nutrients out of the blood. So here's glucose and amino acids and all that in the blood. This cell pulls it out of the blood and then passes it through its own cytoplasm until it gets to the neuron. And so it takes food from the capillary and passes it to the neuron. And so they're responsible for nourishment. And so they anchor the neurons to their nutrients. They also do a bunch of other things. They support and they brace neurons. When you look at them, look, they have these arms, and so they can hold things in place. They brace things. They also guide neurons when they're moving and when they're developing. And then another thing they do is they control the environment around the neurons. So neurons are very, very delicate. It's easy to kill a neuron. And so the surrounding fluids, there can't be anything in there that's bad. Well, sometimes we eat stuff that is bad. So you might eat, I don't know, some kind of poison accidentally or toxin or something, and it's in your blood. Well, if that were to get out here, it would kill this neuron. And once you kill a neuron, it's very, very difficult to replace them. And so usually they're just gone forever. And so what happens is this astrocyte builds another wall around the capillary. And you can see this wall right here. There it is. Look, it's a solid wall. There are no bare areas at all. Same thing over here. It's a solid wall. Now they show you this just so you know it's a capillary. Same thing here. That's why they show you that in. But it's not like that in the brain of the spinal cord. It's a solid wall. And so it's another barrier that this poison has to cross. And so it's called the blood-brain barrier. And you'll see that abbreviated, the BBB, the blood-brain barrier. And so not everything that's in blood can get out because it can't cross that membrane. It gets there, and so it cannot penetrate it and get out into the nervous system. Because anything that can get out here can affect these neurons. It can affect them in lots of different ways. Here's an example. How many of you take an antihistamine or have ever taken an antihistamine? You know, these are things like when you get some sort of allergy, people take these antihistamines. Some people take them every single day. Well, antihistamines come into two groups. And I don't really want to talk about the groups or the structures, but here's an example of each group. One group, or one example, is Benadryl. So that's one type of antihistamine. And then here's another type, Claritin. Well, have any of you ever taken Benadryl? How do you feel if you take Benadryl? What does Benadryl make you feel like? Sleepy, exactly. Some people get dizzy, but mostly sleepy and tired, and you can't think straight. You're just and you yawn, and you do all kinds of things all day long. And then Claritin, if you take Claritin, does it make you feel sleepy, tired, and make you yawn and all that, make you drowsy? It tends not to. In fact, it's called non-drowsy. Well, here's why. One of these can cross the blood-brain barrier and one of them cannot. So one of these can get out of the blood and affect the neurons, and the other one can't because it can't get out of the blood and into the central nervous system. Which one do you think is which? Which one do you think can cross the blood-brain barrier? That's exactly right. Benadryl can cross the blood-brain barrier. And so if you take Benadryl, it affects these neurons. And it affects them by making them slow down. They don't process information very quickly, not nearly as quickly as they do without it. Does it make sense to everyone? So you can kind of see just how important these astrocytes are. Let's look at another one, microglia. So micro means small, and these are very small compared to the other ones. They also tend to be oval shaped, but what's weird about them is they have all these little weird arms and these thorny looking processes that stick out. Well, a better way of thinking these, besides thinking of a thorn, think of them like fingers, because that's what they do. They use these things to grab stuff. They grab things that are not supposed to be in here. They grab it and they take it in here and they digest it, they kill it, they eat it. And so these cells are phagocytes. And if you remember from general biology, phagocytosis means cell eating. And that's what these do. They eat stuff. And what they eat are things like microorganisms, also debris, any kind of damaged or injured neurons, things like that. And so these are a little bit like tiny little policemen. They're also like tiny little janitors. They go around and they clean up and get rid of things that are not supposed to be there. Let's look at another one. These are called ependymal cells. So if you look at that, that looks like epithelial tissue, sort of. And that's what they are. They're epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue is surface tissue. We talked about it. It's got an apical surface, it's got a basement membrane, and remember there's always going to be space out here where they're facing. So here are the cells. They're sitting on a basement membrane and they face this space. Some epithelial tissues have cilia. And that's exactly what these cells are like. They can be squamous, they can be cuboidal, they can be columnar. They can be ciliated. And where you find them is in the hollow spaces of the brain. The brain and the spinal cord are both hollow. So if you draw the brain like this and the spinal cord like this, it's hollow in the middle. So in the brain, it looks like this inside. It's a hollow space, a big hollow space, and this one, and then another one. And then the brain has a little hollow space, the spinal cord has a little hollow space all the way down. And so these cells are right here. That's where these cells are. They line these hollow spaces. And the hollow spaces are not empty, they have fluid in them. The fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid nourishes the brain, removes waste products, and so on. And it has to be moved. Well, instead of having a heart, we have these little cells that have cilia, and the cilia move it along. So, ependymal cells, they line these hollow spaces of the brain and spinal cord, and remember, they have all these different shapes. They are epithelial tissue. And then the last one in the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. So cyte means cell, dendro means tree or tree branches. And oligo means few. So it's a cell with a few branches like a tree. And when you look at them, they look like this. So again, they're going to have these arms, but they're not like astrocytes. They don't have anything to do with nutrition. What they do is they wrap the neuron almost like a jelly roll. Look, they wrap around it just like this, like a jelly roll. Well, they have a few arms. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 arms. And so they wrap around in like 7 places like a jelly roll. And they have a substance in them, which is called myelin. So these are myelin producing cells. They make the substance myelin. And so they form these myelin sheaths, a sheath like a sock almost. And so look, there's a sheath around that neuron, a sheath around that neuron. And inside here is myelin. One thing about these cells is, look, these arms don't touch each other. There's a bare area in between every one of them, a bare area where there is no myelin. You can see it on every single one of them. And these bare spots are called nodes of Ranvier. Ranvier is a French scientist. And so it's a person's name. And so we're trying to get away from things named after people. So they're also called neurofibril nodes. But look, nodes, nodes. So these are little bare areas. So that's a node. And you can see a bunch of these. So if you look here, this is a slice through the spinal cord, or the brain, actually, I don't know which it is. But we should be able to look in here and we should be able to name these cells. So let's look at number 1. Anybody want to hazard a guess which one of those neuroglia this is? This is an oligodendrocyte. And look, what is that little spot right there, that bare area? That's a node. And then look at number 2. Look, it's connecting a capillary. Here's a capillary to a neuron over here. So what is that one? Anybody want to guess? It's an astrocyte. And then here's that one with those little weird arms that look like fingers. What is that one? That one's a microglia. And then look, here's a hollow space up here. So what are the cells facing hollow space called? Those are ependymal cells. And then the blue ones, we haven't gotten to those really yet, but those are the neurons. Those are the cells all of these things are trying to protect, provide nutrition for, all of that stuff. Any questions? Can everybody look at that and figure out which cells are which? Zoe, are we doing all 4? No, there's no way. We're doing 1 probably and part of 2. We're going to get to right around noon and then we're going to stop. Okay, so here are those. That's the ones we've talked about. So again, we talked about astrocytes, we talked about microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. But there's also 2, remember, in the peripheral nervous system. And so if you look at those, these are two, they're called satellite cells and Schwann cells. And Schwann, it's not swan like the bird, but Schwann, it's a man's name. But there's not been any kind of move or impetus to change this one yet, but eventually it probably will too. But here are those. Here's satellite cells, and here's Schwann cells. So let's look at these. So satellite cells are a little bit like astrocytes. So remember what astrocytes did? They surrounded and protected and all that stuff for the neurons in the central nervous system. Well, they do that for cells in the peripheral nervous system. And these cells here are sensory neurons. There are no motor ones out here. And so these satellite cells surround and protect the place where the nucleus is. That's called the cell body. So what they do is they wrap themselves around this cell body of a sensory neuron. And so when you look at them, they look like this. There they are right there. Here's the cell body right here. And you can see the nucleus in there. This is a sensory neuron. So our satellite cells do the exact same thing we saw before. They protect, they provide nourishment, they take care of the chemical environment, and so on, but of these sensory neurons. And then if you look at Schwann cells do this. In this picture, they look a little bit like marshmallows, but if you blow them up, they look like this. So it's another sort of jelly roll kind of thing. And remember, we saw the jelly roll with oligodendrocytes, and oligodendrocytes make myelin. Well, so do Schwann cells. So they make myelin in this peripheral nervous system. Here's our neuron. What they do is they wrap themselves over and over and over around, and so we get these layers, just like we did before, where we have this myelin. And so they form this myelin sheath. Sorry, too many slides. So they form this myelin sheath. Again, a sheath is a little bit like a sock. And then again, if you look at them, look, they have these little bare areas between the cells. And just like before, those are called nodes, nodes of Ranvier or neurofibril nodes. So we have two cells that make this myelin. So let's talk a little bit about myelin. So myelin is a really, really important thing in the nervous system, because what it does is it speeds up how fast they can send their signals. Remember, it's electricity, and they're sending their signal or their electricity down their surface like this. Well, the faster you can get here, the faster you can tell the heart to speed up or slow down. The faster you can tell a muscle to contract so that you can pick up something or close your eyes or do anything else, move your tongue while you're talking. And so if it's very slow, things are not going to work very well. Think about a computer that's very, very slow. In other words, you have, I don't know, only 2 megabytes of RAM or something. It takes forever to do anything you want to do. But if you can speed that up to, I don't know, 8 or even 16 megabytes of RAM, then you got a whole lot of extra speed. And so this zooms down here to tell the heart to do what it's supposed to. Well, when you add myelin to a neuron, it speeds up how fast those electrical impulses travel. And look how fast it can speed it up. It can speed it up as much as 300 times faster. The only cells that make myelin are those two cells we already talked about, oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system and Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. Those are the only cells that can make myelin. And so the only part of your body that has myelin associated with it is the nervous system. No other parts of the body use myelin, just the nervous system. And it's just these cells that make it. So when you look at it, here's the two different types. There's our oligodendrocytes. Again, only in the central nervous system. And look, only a few arms. So look, this one is wrapped around 3 neurons, a few arms. But Schwann cells don't have arms. They wrap themselves around a single neuron over and over and over like this. So that's one Schwann cell, and that's another Schwann cell, and that's another one, and so on. And then don't forget, whether it's an oligodendrocyte or a Schwann cell, we're going to have these nodes of RAIN-VA. So how a Schwann cell does it is, look, it comes up to our neuron. There's our neuron. And look, it just barely wraps around it right now, but it keeps doing it over and over and over. And in other words, it grows. It grows like this and just keeps growing around and around and around. And what's going to happen is we're going to wind up with lots and lots and lots of layers. And these layers form this myelin sheath. The same thing happens with oligodendrocytes, but remember, they do it with arms, not with their whole cell. So look, there's our neuron right there. And here is the Schwann cell right here. And so look in here, and you can see a bunch of layers in here. If we turn that up and change color, look, you can see it in here. Lots of layers. And then we have these neurofibril nodes, which are these gaps in and between these Schwann cells, also between the oligodendrocytes. So look, here's a neuron. And so look, there's our Schwann cells. And then here are the nodes right here. Any questions? So, if you look at the node, that's what it really and truly looks like. That's a node. So there's a Schwann cell, and there's another Schwann cell. And then they have the same thing with oligodendrocytes. But look, we have fewer layers, and one cell wraps around multiple neurons. This one's wrapped around 3. Here we're going to have more layers, and a cell only wraps around 1 neuron over and over and over and over. Everybody tell these apart? Any questions about them? Okay, not all neurons have myelin. So I could have one neuron that would look like this, and one neuron that would look like this. So one neuron is unmyelinated, and the other one here is myelinated. So which one of these do you think is going to be fast and which one's going to be slow? Number 1, is it going to be fast or slow? Slow. Number 2 is going to be fast. And the more myelin you have, the faster it is. So if I add more myelin on top of this, it gets even faster. So depending on how much myelin you have, that determines how fast this neuron is. Any questions about neuroglia? Okay, well, let's look at neurons then. So remember, neurons are the functional units of the nervous system. So they're the ones that do those functions. Remember, there are only three functions. There's one that's a sensory function. And so these neurons that are doing this are picking up information. It's all about information gathering. Could be internal, could be external. And then we have integrative function. And so these neurons, what they're doing is compiling all of this information, and they're making decisions. And then finally, the other function is the motor function. They're going to be driving or telling others what to do. Well, when you look at neurons, they're all pretty much the same. They have some different parts to them. So here's a naked neuron. This is unmyelinated. So this is one of those slow ones. Remember, if it were myelinated, the myelin would be like this. But this one doesn't have any myelin. But it does have what all neurons have. And so when we look at it, we're going to see that every single neuron is this one's doing this function. So sometimes they're called structural and functional units of the nervous system. And so they're going to have things called a body, they're going to have an axon, they're going to have dendrites. And they're the ones that are going to do this talking or signaling to other cells. So look here, these yellow things are the dendrites. There's the cell body, and here's the axon. So if we look at those, the cell body is where the nucleus is. It's also where the organelles are. And so this is where the cell makes stuff. So this is the biosynthetic center of the cell. This is where everything is actually made. So it's where the ribosomes are, the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And you can see that rough endoplasmic reticulum. And here, in this type of cell, it has a different name. It's called Nissl bodies. Now, Nissl is another person's name, and eventually that'll probably go away too. But all it is rough endoplasmic reticulum. It's endoplasmic reticulum with ribosomes on it. So remember, ribosomes are where we assemble proteins. And so this is a protein producing part of the cell. This is the biosynthetic part of the cell. And so when we look at it, there's the cell body right there, this part. And if you look in here, you can see Nissl. That's Nissl substance right there. All those little dots that you see are ribosomes. And there's our nucleus. That's where the DNA is. There's Golgi. Remember, this is the biosynthetic part of the cell. And then we have these little processes that stick off. Processes come in two types. They're sort of little arm-like things that extend from the cell body. There are two types. We have dendrites and we have axons. So here are dendrites and here is an axon. So if you look at dendrites, they tend to be very short. They tend to be branched like crazy. So they look like this over here. See how branched they are? Remember, dendro means tree, so they look like tree branches. And this is the part of the cell that receives information. So another way to think about these is to think of them like little antennae or something. It's like a little antenna. So all of these things, those are the dendrites. And we're going to have lots of dendrites. Again, they receive information here. And then we have an axon. Usually there's only one axon. There's only one. And they're long. They're long axons. They're unbranched. But there's usually only one. This is where we're going to find myelin. If we have myelin, it's on the axon. Well, remember, this cell doesn't have any myelin, but if it did, it would only be here on the axon, nowhere else. And so if we did have Schwann cells, they would be wrapped around here. This is where they'd be. If we did have oligodendrocytes, remember they have these arms. This is where the arm would be, out here like this. Maybe another arm like this. Then they also do 2 or 3 other cells, but only on the axon, nowhere else. So what axons do is they send information this way. So they're not receiving information, they're sending information. And at the other end, there's going to be some cell over here that they're talking to. So the information goes this way, and it only goes this way. It only goes in one direction. Over here, it goes this way, toward the cell body. So this side's picking up information, receiving it, and then this side is sending information. And then if you go all the way to the end of the axon, we wind up with another little branched area. So here's our axon, and then it branches out again, almost like another tree. So there's that word dendro again. But this is the tree at the end. And the word for at the end is telo. So this is called telodendria. So when you look at it, these are the telodendria. They're not dendrites. They look like them, but they're not dendrites. The information is still going this way, not going the other way. It's going this way. All they are little branches at the end of the axon. And then if you look at the very end of these telodendria, you see these little enlarged areas, and they're called end bulbs. So if you look at the telodendria, they swell out like this at the very end. And inside those telodendria are going to be chemicals. The chemicals we're going to use to talk to the other cell. So when you look at this, you should be able to name all these parts. So there's our dendrites. There's our axon. There's our cell body. There's our telodendria. And there's our little end bulbs. Can everybody do that? Remember, this cell has no myelin. But look at this one. So, same thing. So here are the dendrites. There's our cell body. Here's our axon. And then look, there's Schwann cells. And then there's our little nodes of Ranvier in between. And then down here is our telodendria, and right there's our little end bulbs. Now, unfortunately, end bulbs go by lots of different names. They can be called end bulbs. They can be called synaptic knobs. They can be called axon terminals. It just depends on who you're reading. But still, you should be able to pick out all these parts. Can everybody do that? Any questions about it? So look at this. These are muscle cells. This is a muscle cell right here, and so are these others. And so remember, muscle cells are specialized to contract, but this is skeletal muscle. And remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means we're going to choose when it contracts. So the brain over here is going to make that decision, or the spinal cord is going to make that decision. And so a neuron has to go all the way from the brain or the spinal cord, and then it gets to this nerve, and that's exactly what we see right here. This is that neuron right here, and here's our telodendria, and then these are the end bulbs right here. And if you look inside those end bulbs, remember these are chemicals in here that are going to tell this to contract. And that's how we're going to talk to and control the muscle. So this neuron is a somatic efferent. Everybody remember what that means? What does somatic mean? What does efferent mean? Everybody remember that? And so when we look at it, if you blow it up even more, you can even see the individual little chemicals in here that are going to tell this muscle to contract. Well, remember we had different types of neuroglia. We also have different types of neurons. And remember, this is anatomy and physiology. And so we can classify things using an anatomical classification, but we can also classify things using a physiological classification. So remember, anatomy means structure. It's all about form. And so if we use an anatomical classification, what we're going to do is we're going to look at it and we're going to see what's there. And so it's very easy to do. All we're going to do is find the cell body. So here's the cell body with a nucleus in it. And then we're going to count how many things stick off of it, how many processes there are. And so this is the kind of the one we looked at already, but they don't all look exactly like this. So let's look at what they look like. Here are 3 types of neurons using this anatomical classification. This is the type we've been looking at. So everybody remember what these are called? What are those things? Those are dendrites. And then what is this thing here? That's a axon. So look, what we're going to do is we're going to find the cell body. There's our cell body right there. There's our nucleus. And we're going to count how many things touch or come off of the cell body. So look, if I count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things came off of this cell body. 5 dendrites and 1 axon. So when there's more than one, it's called multipolar. So this is a multipolar neuron. Does everybody see why it's called that? Let's look at this one over here. So there's our cell body. There's our nucleus right there. And then look, when I count this, there's only 1, 2 things attached to it. Now look, there's dendrites, but what happens is all of these dendrites turn into or fuse into a single dendrite. So we have 1 dendrite and then there's 1 axon. So 2. And if it equals 2, it's bipolar. So this is a bipolar neuron. The only one that's a little confusing is this one in the middle. And here's what makes it confusing. Here's the dendrites. They look like dendrites. But the axon actually starts here. The axon doesn't start with the cell body. It starts here. So look, if it starts here, this whole thing is an axon. So if I find my cell body, look, there's only one thing touching it, just the axon. That's all that's touching it. One thing. So unipolar. Does that make sense? Any questions? Can everybody do this? Here's another way to tell a unipolar neuron. Look, all the others look like this, and here are the things that stick off. Looks like this, and here are the things that stick off. But the unipolar one, the cell body sticks out to the side. It's not in the middle at all. Cell body's off to the side. That's probably the easiest way to recognize this. Look, the cell body is here, off to the side. So that's an anatomical way of classifying neurons. There's another way to classify neurons too, and this is a functional or physiological classification. And remember, there are only three functions. There's a sensory function, there's a motor function, and there's an integrative function. And so if a cell is picking up sensory information, it's a sensory neuron. If a cell is telling others to do, it's a motor neuron. And if it's doing it's an integrative neuron. So look at this. So here's a guy, and he sees this glass of water. And so somehow or another, he's going to have to know that this is a glass of water, so he has to see it, and that's in the eye, and then it's going to get sent to the brain. So right here's his eyeball. And so there's a neuron sending that information to the brain. And that information is just, what does this thing look like? In other words, the shape, the color, whatever it is. So it's sort of cylinder shaped. It's got this light blue stuff in it or clear stuff in it. And it's the brain going to take all of that info and decide what this is. And the brain is going to decide it's a glass of water. And then the brain is going to make a decision. And the decision, in this case, was to pick up the glass of water. But your eyeball can't pick up water. Your brain can't pick up water. The only thing that can pick up water is the muscle. And so the brain is going to use a neuron to send information to that muscle to tell it to pick up the glass of water. So look, there's three neurons involved here. There's one that's picked up the fact that there's water in a glass and is going to send that information. That's a sensory neuron. There's one in here. There's a neuron that's going to make a decision. What am I going to do about this glass of water? That's an integrative or interneuron. And then there's the third neuron, which is going to tell this muscle to pick it up. And that is a motor neuron. So when we look at this, a functional classification just tells you what the neuron is doing. So sensory neurons do a sensory function. Integrative or interneurons do an integrative function. And motor neurons tell some other cell what to do. So if we were to use our classification system, remember our classification? So is this part, do you think that this is is this on the body wall, or is this an internal organ? It's on the body wall. So what's the word for that? Somatic. And in this information, is it going toward the central nervous system or away? What's the word for toward? So that's a somatic afferent neuron. But look at this one. What is this one going to be? Again, body wall. So what is this one going to be? Somatic efferent, exactly. And so remember, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Make sense to everyone? Any questions? Now, I don't know what he's going to do with that drink of water, the glass of water. He could drink it. He could pour it out. I don't know what's happening, but I know that he picked it up. Okay, and then one last thing, and we'll take a short break. And that is, when you look at those neurons, remember we said neurons could be myelinated or not myelinated. So if this is a neuron and it's myelinated, it's got myelin on it. Well, myelin is white. If you look at it, it's white. You can see it, especially if there's a bunch of neurons here that are all myelinated. In other words, there's a lot of myelin in here. It's going to look white. But I could also have neurons that are not myelinated. Neurons that are not myelinated are not white. In a living person, they're kind of pink. But in a cadaver, they turn gray. And so when people started dissecting, what they saw were these white areas. And since it was a cadaver, they saw gray areas. And so they named these white areas white matter, and these gray areas gray matter. So white matter is where myelin is found. Remember, myelin is only on axons. And then the area that doesn't have any myelin is going to be unmyelinated fibers, but also the part of the cell that doesn't have any myelin on it. So it's going to be things like cell bodies and dendrites. So when you look at it in a person, you can actually visually, even without a microscope, we can see white matter and gray matter. Look, this is white. This is all white in here. That's white matter. But we can also see gray matter. Now remember, in a living person, it's not gray, it's pink. But this is the gray matter. So we can pick out areas that's white matter. Remember, white matter is going to be myelinated axons. And the gray matter is going to be unmyelinated axons, but also cell bodies and dendrites. And you can see that throughout this section of the brain. Any questions? Can everybody pick out the difference between white matter and gray matter? So look, that's white matter, that's white matter, that's white matter. All of this is white matter, and you can see it running through here. All of this. And then gray matter, oops, is all of this. Any questions? Okay, let's stop there and take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more. This is the end of the first PowerPoint, so we'll be using the second PowerPoint when we come back. So let's see, it's 10:15. Let's come back about 10:25.